We're just about 15 minutes past the hour. They were the targets of a mob on January 6th, but yet this coming week
have already announced they oppose it, including North Carolina's Richard Burr, who's poised to filibuster the matter, thus blocking even debate on it. CNN congressional reporter Daniela Diaz is with us. Daniela, always good to see you this morning. So the commission's just one of the pressing issues we know getting stalled in the Senate. Talk to us about what's happening.
Christy, Boris, it's not just this 9/11 style commission to investigate the January 6th insurrection that has stalled in the Senate. It's practically dead on arrival, honestly. But there's a lot of pieces of legislation that have already passed the House and are sitting in the Senate as Democrats try to negotiate with Republicans on something that can pass this 60-vote threshold that is needed to break any filibuster on any pieces of this legislation. So let's start with this 9/11 style commission on the insurrection. It passed the House with 35 House Republicans voting in favor of it, which is a notable number. But now it's dead on arrival in the Senate as many Republicans who even voted to convict Donald Trump in his second impeachment trial have come out and say that they do not support this, namely Senator Richard Burr, who you guys just mentioned, who is actually has been working behind the scenes to convince other Senate Republicans not to support this legislation. And then there's also police reform. This bipartisan group of negotiators, Senator Tim Scott, a Republican from South Carolina, Congresswoman Karen Bass, a Democrat from California, and Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey, a Democrat. They've been working behind the scenes these last couple of weeks to try to reach a deal by May 25th. That's this self-imposed deadline will be the year anniversary of George Floyd's death. But they've been unable to reach a deal on many issues. They continue to work behind the scenes, but they will not reach this May 25th deadline they've given themselves. And I haven't even mentioned infrastructure. There was a conference call yesterday, meeting between the White House and Senate Republicans who have been working with the White House to try to reach a deal on infrastructure, where the White House made several concessions and proposed a new infrastructure proposal to the Senate Republicans. They brought the price tag down from $2.25 billion to $1.7 billion, but Senate Republicans weren't happy with this counteroffer. They expressed anger, frustration with the White House for their not being able to meet in the middle on this issue of infrastructure. So that's also another issue that has stalled in the Senate. Again, this all is about this 60-vote threshold in the Senate. Even if every single Democrat, all 50, try to support legislation, they still need at least 10 Senate Republicans to pass any bill in the Senate. It always goes back to the filibuster. We always talk about it. So the question is whether Senate Republicans, Senate Democrats, the White House will be able to meet in the middle on these issues that the President Joe Biden really wants to pass through Congress.
All right, Daniela Diaz, we appreciate it so much. Thank you. So CNN political analyst Laura Barone Lopez with us. She's a White House correspondent at Politico. Also joining us, Lynn Sweet, Washington bureau chief for the Chicago Sun-Times. Ladies, it's so good to have you with us as always. I want to ask you about this infrastructure bill. If you've got 16 GOP House members who co-sponsored a bill and then they voted against it, you have to ask why. Lynn, let's listen to what Errol Lewis said to that question earlier this morning.
The violent attempt to overturn the election of President Biden was done at the behest of Donald Trump, who is now in complete fingertip control of the Republican Party. They do what they are told to do.
Lynn, is that accurate?
Yes, and here's why. That original bill, actually, on a commission, was sponsored by a Republican, Rodney Davis of Illinois. He had 30 Republican co-sponsors. He put the bill in January 12th. That's the day before Trump got impeached for the second time. So of the 30, all Republicans, so important to know. So this should not have been a surprise, right? That 16 peeled off. The only reason is that most of them come from very Republican districts, Christy, which means that they are very, very vulnerable to a Republican primary challenge from the right. That's the only thing that changed. And that shows the hold that Trump still has on the Republican Party, because already there's a target on their back to get them primaried.
Laura, I think what's so surprising to some people is that these are lawmakers who lived through a pretty terrifying time, and it was hard to watch from this side of the screen, obviously. So what do you think, as Lynn just talked about, the vulnerability in the political arena, but beyond that, is there a hold that Donald Trump has on these people, or is this all specifically politically driven to save their jobs?
I think it's exactly like Lynn said, which is that they think that their political survival, their way to winning majorities in the House and the Senate, is by staying tethered to Trump. If they break away from him, they think that they're going to lose more seats. Now, it could be a risky calculation because of the fact that Trump lost the House, he lost the Senate, he lost the presidency in the span of his 4 years. And there is very well could be a shrinking Republican base. But Republicans have decided that in order to survive, they want to stick right by his side. So far, going so far as to continue spreading his lies about the election to do it.
So I wanted to ask you, Lynn, about President Biden, because he told the New York Times this week, quote, "The progressives don't like me because I'm not prepared to take on what I would say, and they would say, is a socialist agenda." What do we know about his relationship with the more progressive congressmen and women, and the focus that they're trying to have on the legislation that is being passed? Or not?
They're keeping pressure on him. Let's look at it this way, Christy. It's situational, bill by bill. Know what you can get, know what you can't. Everything, though, has to be done really in the first 2 years of Biden White House, or else you may lose that House or Senate that we're talking about right now. So the opposition in the party is important, but it will be paced out. Once you get some, Biden will eventually figure out a way to give enough of the progressives of what they want as time goes by, knowing the clock is ticking.
Laura, you wrote an article, a great article, about Joe Biden senator versus Joe Biden president, and Bidenomics, and how he is addressing the fiscal responsibility, I guess we should say. How likely is it that he is going to be able to navigate a victory on infrastructure, let's say, based on his views as president and views as he was as a senator, and the workings that, behind closed doors that he did over all of these years with other lawmakers who are still have a voice there?
Yeah, Christy, throughout his 40-plus decade career, Biden very much was a fiscal hawk. During his time in the Senate, he voted for the Reagan tax cuts. He voted for Bill Clinton's welfare reform, used to tout a balanced budget, which would have made it really impossible to deficit spend, which is what he did with the first big stimulus bill. And so his trajectory very much mirrors the trajectory of the Democratic Party writ large, which is this shift more towards being okay with deficit spending and really trying to show voters that big government is good for them. And so that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to still keep his proposals very big, even as he's negotiating with Republicans. As Daniela said, they only went down $500 billion in their traditional infrastructure proposal to try to work with Republicans. But publicly, they're still very far apart, Republican senators and the White House. And it really is looking like a bipartisan deal on traditional infrastructure is not going to happen. That doesn't mean Biden isn't going to be able to pass this big bill, though, because, again, we've talked about it a lot this year, budget reconciliation. That's his route. If he decides to cut bait and not work with Republicans anymore because they are coming up on that Memorial Day marker where they want to reassess, then they could very well move forward with just Democratic support and try to pass his big spending proposals through the reconciliation process.
We know, Lynn, that Republicans are frustrated because they don't feel like the White House is engaging them enough when it comes to the infrastructure bill. The White House brought their package down from 2.2 to 1.7 billion. Republicans are not happy still with that. What is the realistic expectation that even beyond infrastructure, as Daniela was talking about police reform, about January 6th, that there could be any sort of compromise? Can the Democrats do anything differently to try to engage with Republicans.
Well, first you have to make sure that you have Democrat Joe Manchin on board. And to do that, you have to make sure to him and possibly Senator Sienna, I mean, it's down to them to make sure that you showed you did everything possible to be bipartisan. And actually, I think that shows that you do first have to pass that infrastructure bill, and maybe you go down to $800 billion. I believe there is some feeling among Democrats on the Hill, go for a traditional infrastructure bill, bricks and mortar. Then when you take the social infrastructure items, you take that out, get a bipartisan bill, show you have something done, because maybe real people out there who vote may not care about 800 billion or 1 trillion. They just want something. Show you got that done with Republicans. Then you move on to policing, immigration, and the items that you do in reconciliation, which, by the way, because of all those rules in the Senate, isn't as easy as it sounds. But at least we know that the Biden team then will have a better political stance within the party and externally, even among Republicans, to show that they have one thing under their belt. Then they move on alone. Because, as I said, the clock's ticking. They only may have until the midterms.
Yeah, very good point. Laura Barone-Lopez and Lynn Sweet, your perspectives are important to us. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
The conflict is Natan Sachs. He's the director for the Center of Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. Natan, good morning. Thank you so much for spending some of your weekend with us. I want to start I want to start by something you wrote in a recent piece for Brookings, explaining that this is different from the typical cyclical fighting that we've seen between Israel and Hamas. You write this, quote, "The tribal lines evoked in this violence, this perfect storm of grievances and fears, will remain when the guns finally fall silent." The guns have mostly fallen silent, so what has made the last few weeks different in your eyes?
Well, what we're seeing is a ceasefire that hopefully will hold between Israel and Hamas, and that is excellent. But what led to this round of violence, if we can call it that, was very different than previous times. It wasn't just Hamas demanding changes to the Israeli-Egyptian blockade of the Gaza Strip, or Israel discovering some Hamas capability that it felt it had to take out. Rather, what we saw was clashes mostly in Jerusalem, and then demonstrations in the West Bank that led then to Hamas seeing an opening and trying to take control or take leadership of this conflict. And then we saw even clashes inside Israel. So what we're seeing now is not Israel, just Israel-Hamas and a ceasefire between them, but also a much broader conflict where other territories, East Jerusalem in particular, but also the West Bank and Israel, with communal violence between Jews and Israel and Jews and Arabs, Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. A lot of that has died down now inside Israel, which is excellent. But especially if you look at Jerusalem, we have already seen clashes on Temple Mount or Haram al-Sharif around the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and we could see more. And if you recall, a lot of this began with the looming eviction of Palestinian families from homes in East Jerusalem. That possible eviction is still looming. The Supreme Court of Israel is to rule on this. It postponed the ruling so as not to inflame things further. But that ruling will come. And all the ingredients for much of what we saw, I hope not the same with Hamas and Israel, but the rest of what we saw, all the ingredients are still there.
Yeah, and so with conflicts over land rights, that eviction that you mentioned still looming, tensions boiling over at holy sites, it obviously remains unsolved. So from your perspective, what needs to happen for this to be a lasting ceasefire? Where is the path to peace here? Is there one?
Well, I think we need to first lower our expectations about peace. In the past, we've always talked about huge negotiations that would bring about an Israeli-Palestinian final status agreement. That's just not in the cards, and I think the American administration recognizes that. Certainly the Israelis and the Palestinians do. But that doesn't mean that you can't do anything. In the past, we've always had this all-or-nothing approach. Either we reach a final status agreement or we throw our hands up in the air, and that was a mistake. Instead, we need to look at the various problems and try to solve them. Some of them are very long-term, deep structural solutions that would be very difficult. Some of them can be done much faster. So, for example, between Israel and Gaza, there are a lot of things that can be done far short of any peace, because there is not going to be any peace between Hamas and Israel. But there can be a significant easing of the blockade if there were ways in which Hamas could credibly commit not to arming and firing at Israel. The two sides have negotiated in the past, indirectly of course, about the possibility of a long-term ceasefire. I'm skeptical they can reach some kind of formal agreement, but that doesn't mean there can't be tacit arrangements via the Egyptians, and perhaps even bringing in the Palestinian Authority from Ramallah, which is very difficult because of the animosity between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, but allowing for much more movement of people and goods, allowing for an opening up of the Gaza Strip, which would be extremely important. Whether or not it prevents the next round of violence, it would improve dramatically the lives of 2 million people living in the Gaza Strip under Hamas rule and blockaded by Israel and Egypt. That's the kind of thing that can be done in the short term. In East Jerusalem, inside Israel, and in the West Bank, there's a whole set of other actors. Israel, prominently, of course, a Palestinian Authority, very importantly. They had postponed elections that they had just called, and we see really a political deadlock almost, a stagnation of the political scene in the Palestinian Authority. So a lot of homework needs to be done on both sides, politically, Israel and the Palestinian Authority, but also, to my mind, a deep rethink in Israeli strategy and Israeli policy with regard to East Jerusalem, at the very least, so as not to create these kinds of scenarios that we saw in the past few weeks.
Yeah, and certainly the United States has a huge role in that, and potentially the Biden administration naming an ambassador to Israel in the next few weeks will be an instrumental move. Natan Sachs, unfortunately, we have to leave the conversation there, but we appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Of course. The good news is that more kids and teens are beginning to get the COVID vaccine. The bad news is that fewer adults are opting to get vaxxed. Up next, Polo Sandoval joins us live with details on why the low vaccination rate is concerning and some creative incentives being offered to entice people to roll up their sleeves. But there's really good news when it comes to COVID. The United States averaging around 31,000 new COVID cases this past week. That's the lowest average in nearly a year. Health officials, though, they're still worried because of declining vaccination rates across the country.
And over the past week, less than 2 million doses were administered per day. That's a 46% drop from its peak just a month ago. Less than half of Americans have received at least one vaccine dose, and only 38% of the population is fully vaccinated. We know that is a long way from herd immunity, considering the fact that we need 75 to 80% vaccination for that.
Yeah, let's get to CNN's Polo Sandoval. He has more on how states are pushing to increase vaccinations. Polo, do we know what areas of the country specifically are lagging?
Well, Christy and Boris, you guys are referring to some of those states with the lowest vaccinations per capita. Many of those are in the southeast. They include states like Louisiana, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and so on. So what concerns officials right now, with about 62% of the population not yet fully vaccinated, is what will happen if vaccination rates throughout the country don't get a much-needed boost.
Ready?
Another dose of progress this weekend. By now, 1 out of every 12 people in the U.S. ages 12 to 15 have received their first COVID-19 vaccine dose, according to the CDC. And efforts to get shots into younger arms are less than 2 weeks in. The U.S. also averaging fewer than 30,000 new COVID cases a day.
The last time the 7-day average of cases per day was this low was June 18th. 2020.
Along with dropping case counts, the country is seeing less COVID hospitalizations. None at one of the Bay Area's biggest hospitals for the first time in 14 months.
It feels like a milestone. There are 0 admissions at San Francisco General.
Encouraging statistics mean more reopenings. Ahead of the weekend, Delaware lifted its mask and social distancing mandates as well as capacity limits. California drops all capacity restrictions when the state fully reopens June 15th. And Michigan, which struggled with a severe COVID surge just a few weeks ago, announced it's returning to full capacity for outdoor events on June the 1st. Michigan's governor aiming to do the same indoors come July.
Now it comes to how do we live in communities and with each other between those that are vaccinated and unvaccinated. These are things that time will tell, but also taking into account continuing that message of the importance of vaccination.
Some state officials crediting improved vaccination rates for restoring more normalcy for the residents. Nationally, though, the Biden administration is concerned. The average daily pace of coronavirus vaccinations is down almost 50% from its peak last month. States like Oregon adding a shot at a jackpot in exchange for a shot in the arm.
If you've been waiting to get a vaccine or you just haven't gotten around to it yet, we're going to give you an extra incentive. How about a chance to win $1 million?
A similar incentive seems to have helped in the Buckeye State. Ohio health officials reporting a 28% increase in vaccinations for people 16 and older following the announcement of $1 million lottery for the vaccinated and full rights scholarships for vaccine recipients under 18. And some recent CDC figures now showing about 1,300 so-called breakthrough cases have been reported. This is the infection of fully vaccinated people. But when you compare that to roughly 127 million people who have been fully vaccinated, the numbers are pretty good there, Christy. So if some of those lotto figures aren't enough to actually get people to get that vaccine, then some of those CDC numbers could potentially suggest, or at least they do show, how effective these vaccines are.
No doubt. Polo Sandoval, thank you. So I know that you still have medical questions about the coronavirus, about the vaccine. Well, Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz' ex-girlfriend apparently is ready to talk. Details on her willingness to cooperate with federal authorities and what it means for Gaetz' sex trafficking investigation.
Plus, grasping for any chance at bipartisanship on Capitol Hill. Several top priorities, including infrastructure, are stalling. Some on the left urging President Biden to go bold and go it alone. We'll hear from Errol Lewis next. We're just about 18 minutes past the hour. Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz at a rally last night showing no signs of the legal pressure building against him. Sources say Gaetz' ex-girlfriend is going to cooperate with federal investigators in their sex trafficking probe.
And just this week, as part of that investigation, a former close friend of Gaetz cut a plea deal. CNN's Paula Reed helped break the story, and she has the details on the allegations and Gaetz' response now.
CNN has learned that a former girlfriend of Congressman Matt Gaetz has agreed to cooperate with investigators. Now, this woman, a former Capitol Hill staffer who did not work for the congressman, she worked for another lawmaker. She is really critical to this investigation because she was linked to the congressman in the summer of 2017. And that time period is really essential to determining whether he had sex with an underage girl. Now, the fact that she has signaled she is willing to cooperate is also notable because we know investigators have hundreds and hundreds of records of transactions that they're sifting through, and they hope that this woman may be able to help them make sense of some of these transactions, including some that allegedly show payments for sex. Now, the congressman has not been charged, and he has repeatedly denied paying for sex or ever having sex with a minor as an adult. Now, it's not clear if this woman has a formal cooperation agreement, but she has signaled to investigators she is willing to talk to them. An attorney for the ex-girlfriend and the Justice Department declined to comment. But there's more. We are also learning that the congressman's former close friend, Joel Greenberg, has also told investigators that the congressman had sexual contact with a 17-year-old girl. Now, earlier this week, Greenberg pleaded guilty to 6 federal counts, including sex trafficking of a minor. Now, he's cooperating as part of a plea agreement, and in exchange, dozens of other counts against him have been dropped. Now, in this plea agreement, Greenberg admits that he had sex with the minor at least 7 times, and that he then introduced her to other adult men who engaged in commercial sex acts with her. But the plea agreement, it doesn't name who those other men are. Now, Gaetz and his representatives have attacked Greenberg's credibility in the past few days. They have correctly pointed out the fact that in this same plea agreement, Greenberg admits to falsely accusing a political rival of having sex with a minor. Now, Greenberg is required to cooperate with investigators as part of this plea deal in any ongoing federal investigations, including, of course, this ongoing investigation into his former close friend. Now, a decision about whether to charge the congressman, that likely won't come for some time. It will fall to prosecutors in the public integrity section of the Justice Department. They are still gathering evidence, and then they will have to assess whether they believe they have enough to proceed with an indictment. Paula Reed, CNN, Washington.
Paula Reed, thanks so much for that. Let's discuss Gaetz and more with CNN political commentator Errol Lewis. He's also a political anchor for Spectrum News and host of the You Decide podcast. Errol, always a pleasure to see you bright and early on Saturday mornings. Let's start with Matt Gaetz and his potential legal trouble. It seems to be mounting. Yesterday, though, he was out in Arizona for a Trump-style rally with Marjorie Taylor Greene. He seems awfully confident. What do you make of the disconnect?
Well, good morning, Boris. The confidence is not only part of his political brand, but it's part of his survival strategy, legally and politically speaking, Boris. He's got to get out there and make sure that for the slice of the electorate that likes his politics and likes his style, he's prominently in a position to build his fundraising list, to ask for money that might eventually end up in a legal defense fund. That's really all he's got at this point. He's almost persona non grata on Capitol Hill. It's not like he has a lot of political allies. It's not like he and the minority party is going to do much legislating. And so he's trying to sort of save his neck. He's in a world of trouble. And let's understand that if he is innocent, even if he is innocent, it's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to take a lot of time for him to get out of this, because Joel Greenberg, who is now sort of cooperating with the federal Justice Department, was a very, very close ally. Again, hundreds of transactions, lots of dates to go through, lots of people that we know Congressman Gaetz has been involved with, and he's going to have to really sort of steer his way through this. It's going to be very expensive, very time consuming. That's why he's on the other side of the country, acting as if he doesn't have a care in the world. He's got nothing but trouble waiting for him in Washington.
Now,
there's another above average active Atlantic hurricane season predicted this year. The season begins June 1st, by the way. There are already 2 systems of concern, though.
Yeah, and this is the 7th season in a row that tropical systems have developed before the official start. And just this morning, we have our first named storm of the season. Let's get to meteorologist Allison Chinchar. She's in the CNN Weather Center. Allison, what's the name, and does this pattern, 7 years now in a row, does this concern you?
Right, yeah, it's certainly something to think about. Good morning. Yes, we're talking about the first storm of the season, subtropical storm Ana. Now, Ana right now, sustained winds of 45 miles per hour. It's gusting even stronger than that. The sub in front of the name really just comes from the fact that it kind of really formed in a little bit of a colder environment than normal, but it still has tropical characteristics. Now, the storm in particular, we do have a tropical storm watch in effect for Bermuda. We anticipate the winds and even some waves to really kick up throughout the day today. But starting tomorrow, it will start to push away from the area back out over open water, which is good news. But as you mentioned, yes, this is the 7th consecutive year in a row where we've really had a named storm before the season begins officially on June 1st. We're 10 days before that. In this form, 12 days before. But what may make this year even more interesting is we may end up with 2 named storms even before the season officially begins. And that's because we're keeping an eye on this developing system just off the coast of Texas in the Gulf of Mexico. It only has a 30% chance of development, but that's more to the fact that it's likely to move inland in less than the next 12 hours. So it just doesn't really likely have much time to continue to strengthen. Regardless, it is anticipated to bring a surge of moisture into areas of Texas. Widespread totals 2 to 4 inches. Some spots could pick up 5, 6, 7, maybe even as much as 8 inches of rain, especially closer to the coast before the system finally pushes out. If it does get named, the next name on the list becomes Bill. Here's the full list of names that will be used this year. Remember, if we use all of these, we will no longer use the Greek alphabet, but rather a new supplemental list that was issued earlier this year. The forecast for this year, though, is calling for another active season. Normally, you have 14 named storms, 7 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. Both NOAA and Colorado State, 2 very important entities that forecast the season, are both anticipating, Boris and Christy, for those numbers to be higher than average. But we all know, regardless of whether you have 17 storms or 1 storm, if it hits you, it's an impactful season.
Yeah, an important reminder. Allison Chinchar, thank you so much for that. Hey, stay with New Day. We'll be back after a quick break.